I stood in the cockpit, arms crossed, staring out at the ghost of a mining station. Hadron-7. The name alone carried weight in the deep space colonies, a cautionary tale of corporate greed, ambition, and inevitable catastrophe. Beyond the reinforced glass, the station hung like a mausoleum against the endless stars, its skeletal frame lit faintly by the glow of the distant nebula. I could feel the unease ripple through the crew behind me. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the way the shadows seemed to breathe with the station's slow rotation. It was the history. Everyone had heard the rumors. "This isn't what I signed up for," muttered Corporal Anders, a stocky mercenary who had been grumbling since we left the jump ship. His voice grated on me, but I said nothing. Let him vent. Fear needed an outlet, and he wasn't the only one feeling it. "Focus," said Captain Darrow, her voice sharp as a blade. "You all knew the risks. We're here to retrieve the data logs and secure the biotech assets. Nothing more, nothing less." Easy for her to say. She was a company woman through and through, with eyes like cold steel and a loyalty bought and paid for. The rest of us? We were expendable. I sighed and adjusted the strap on my chest rig, my fingers brushing the hilt of my combat knife. "Hadron-7, I said, breaking the tension. "Last known coordinates of a research crew that disappeared without a trace. You've all read the brief. They called it an outbreak, but no one ever explained what they meant by that. Now we're here to clean up the mess." "Thanks for the pep talk, Lieutenant Vega," Anders snorted. "Really uplifting." I shot him a glare, but didn't respond. Not worth it. Instead, I focused on the station as we drifted closer. The hull was scarred with impacts, some natural, others less so. Sections of the outer ring had collapsed inward, leaving jagged edges that glinted like broken teeth. Someone whispered a prayer behind me. I didn't blame them. We docked at Portside Alpha, the only airlock still operational according to the schematics. As the ship's magnetic clamps engaged, the hiss of equalizing pressure filled the cabin. I checked my helmet seals and ran through the systems on my HUD. Everything green. Good. "Stay close," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This place has been derelict for years. That means unstable structure, bad air, and who knows what else. Stick together and we'll get through this." Darrow gave me a sidelong glance. She didn't like me taking charge, but she also didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that this was no ordinary salvage mission. The airlock groaned as it cycled open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating walls streaked with rust and strange black growths that pulsed faintly. The station's atmosphere was breathable, but it didn't feel like it. The air was thick, almost oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my skin crawl. "Fan out," Darrow ordered. "Vega, take point." I nodded and moved forward, my boots echoing on the metal floor. The others followed in a staggered formation, their flashlights dancing like fireflies in the dark. The corridor stretched on endlessly, lined with broken consoles and overturned carts. Here and there we found signs of life. Scraps of clothing, a discarded tool, a child's toy half melted into the deck plating, but no bodies. "What the hell happened here?" whispered Dr. Patel, our tech specialist. She was a petite woman with quick hands and a quicker mind, but even she looked rattled. "This doesn't make sense. Where are the remains?" "They're here," I said, my voice grim. "We just haven't found them yet." We reached the central hub, a cavernous space that once served as the station's heart. The ceiling rose high above us, a latticework of cables and girders, many of them dangling like vines. Massive screens lined the walls, flickering with static and half-formed images. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. "All right," Darrow said, pulling up a schematic on her wrist console. We split into teams. "Anders, Patel, you're with me. Vega, take Mendez and Kovac and secure the lower levels. We'll rendezvous in 2 hours." I didn't like splitting up, but arguing would only waste time. "Fine," I said. "You have comms?" "Channel 3, she replied. "Keep it tight." I motioned for Mendez and Kovac to follow me. Mendez was a quiet giant, all muscle and stoicism, while Kovac was a wiry engineer with a nervous laugh that set my teeth on edge. Not exactly a dream team, but I'd make it work. The lower levels were worse, much worse. The black growths were more pronounced here, spreading across the walls and floor like veins. They seemed to pulse with a faint rhythm, almost like breathing. My gut told me to turn back, but orders were orders. We found the crew quarters first. The doors hung open, their edges warped as if melted. Inside, the rooms were ransacked, personal belongings scattered, beds overturned, and walls smeared with something. I didn't want to guess what. "This doesn't feel right," Kovac muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's like they were running from something." "Keep moving," I said, though I felt it too. The sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Then we found the first log terminal, a dusty console half buried under debris. Kovac powered it up, and the screen flickered to life. A video feed played, grainy and distorted. A woman's face appeared, pale, wide-eyed, and frantic. "This is Dr. Elena Marquez, Chief Biotech Officer. If anyone finds this, you have to destroy the station. Do not attempt to retrieve the data. They're not what we thought they were. The feed cut off with a burst of static. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Lieutenant," Mendez said, his voice low, "we should go." "Not yet," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. "We need more information." As we moved deeper into the station, the air grew heavier, the walls closer. The black growths now covered nearly every surface, their pulsations more pronounced. The lights flickered and dimmed, and the faint hum of the station's systems became a low, almost guttural vibration. Then we heard it. A faint scratching sound, distant but distinct. It echoed through the corridor, setting my nerves on edge. "What was that?" Kovac whispered, his voice trembling. "Keep it together," I said, gripping my rifle tighter. "Probably just a loose panel." But I didn't believe that. Not for a second. We rounded a corner and entered a large chamber, the old hydroponics bay. The black growths were thicker here, forming twisted, almost organic shapes that jutted out from the walls and ceiling. In the center of the room was something that froze us all in our tracks, a mass of bodies fused together by the black substance, their faces frozen in silent screams. "Oh my God," Kovac whispered, his flashlight shaking. I stepped closer, my stomach churning. The bodies were human, at least they had been, but something had changed them, twisted them into something unnatural. Then the scratching sound returned, louder this time. It was coming from above. "Lights up!" I barked, raising my rifle. The beam of my flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing a vent cover dangling loosely, and then, with a sound like tearing metal, something moved, something fast, something alive. "Contact!" Mendez shouted, firing his weapon. The thing dropped from the vent, and for a split second I saw it. A nightmare of black chitin and sinew, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It let out a shriek that echoed through the chamber, and then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness. "Fall back!" I yelled, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "Now!" We ran, the sound of the creature's pursuit ringing in our ears. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over. It had just begun. The moment we reached the relative safety of the corridor, I slammed the hatch shut and locked it. My hands were steady, but my chest heaved as adrenaline coursed through my veins. Mendez leaned against the wall, his rifle gripped tightly, while Kovac paced back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. The chamber we'd escaped from still loomed in my mind. The fused bodies, the thing in the shadows, and that sound, the inhuman shriek that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "What the hell was that?" Kovac finally blurted, his voice cracking. "That wasn't human! That wasn't—" "Pull it together, Kovac," I snapped, cutting him off. "We don't have time for panic." "I'm not panicking," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "I'm just processing." "Well, process quieter," Mendez grunted. "We don't need to attract any more attention." I nodded, grateful for his calm. Kovac, can you pull up the station's schematics? We need to find another route to the rendezvous point. Kovac hesitated, his trembling fingers hovering over his datapad. Yeah, give me a second. I turned to Mendez. Did you get a clear look at it? He shook his head. Not really. It moved too fast. All I know is it wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't friendly. I didn't respond, but my thoughts churned. The thing we'd seen was a predator, that much was clear. But it wasn't acting on instinct alone. It had stalked us, studied us, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. That kind of intelligence was far more dangerous than brute strength. We didn't have to wait long for more trouble. As Kovac worked, his datapad connected to the station's network, triggering a ripple of activity. The corridor's lights flickered and flared, and a low hum reverberated through the walls. I tensed, my rifle snapping up to cover the darkened end of the corridor. "What's happening?" I asked. "I don't know," Kovac stammered, frantically tapping at his screen. "The system's rebooting. It must have been in some kind of low-power mode, but now it's—" A distant clang interrupted him, followed by a sound I recognized all too well, the grinding of metal against metal. Something was moving in the walls. "Kovac," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Shut it down. Now." "I'm trying," he hissed. The grinding grew louder, joined by the faint but unmistakable sound of clicking, like nails tapping on steel. My pulse quickened and I glanced at Mendez. He nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Kovac," I repeated. "How much longer?" "Almost there. Almost." The lights in the corridor surged to full brightness, blinding us for a moment. When my vision cleared, the clicking had stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. We didn't wait to find out what was coming. "Kovac, move!" I barked, grabbing his arm and yanking him down the corridor. Mendez covered our rear, his weapon trained on the shadows as we moved quickly but cautiously through the station. The map on Kovac's datapad showed a path to the main reactor, which doubled as a secure location with reinforced doors. It wasn't the rendezvous point Darrow had chosen, but I wasn't about to argue with reality. We needed a defensible position, and we needed it fast. As we rounded a corner, the station seemed to come alive around us. Panels flickered with half-formed images, distorted faces frozen in silent screams. A garbled voice crackled over the intercom, unintelligible, but filled with a sense of urgency. I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a taunt. Then, from somewhere ahead, we heard the sound of movement. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the corridor, accompanied by a guttural growl that made my skin crawl. "We're not alone," Mendez muttered. "No kidding," I replied. "Stay close. Weapons hot." We crept forward, the narrow corridor forcing us into single file. My flashlight beam swept over the walls, revealing more of the black, pulsating growths that seemed to infest the station. The air grew thicker with every step, the metallic tang now mixed with something fouler, something almost organic. The footsteps stopped. I froze, raising my hand to halt the others. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the station's systems. My grip on my rifle tightened. And then, with a deafening crash, a panel burst open ahead of us. Something lunged out, a blur of black chitin and sinew, its claws glinting in the harsh light. I fired instinctively, the muzzle flash illuminating the creature's twisted alien form. It shrieked and recoiled, but not before slashing at Mendez, knocking him to the ground. "Mendez!" I shouted, firing again. The creature snarled and darted into the shadows, too fast for me to track. "I'm fine," Mendez groaned, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his sleeve, but the wound didn't look too deep. "Just a scratch." "Stay behind me," I ordered, pulling him to his feet. "Kovac, how much farther?" "Not far," he said, his voice shaking. "Just 2 more junctions." The reactor room was a fortress compared to the rest of the station. Thick metal doors sealed behind us with a satisfying hiss, and the interior was brightly lit, free of the black growths. I allowed myself a moment of relief as I scanned the room. Consoles lined the walls, their displays glowing faintly with status updates. In the center of the room stood the reactor itself, a massive cylinder humming with contained energy. "This'll do," I said, lowering my weapon. "Mendez, sit down and let me see that arm. Kovac, get those systems running and figure out what the hell we're dealing with." As Mendez sat on a crate, I pulled out a med kit and patched up his wound. He winced, but didn't complain, his usual stoicism intact. "That thing wasn't acting on instinct," he said. "It knew where to hit us." "I know," I replied, keeping my voice low. "These things aren't just predators. They're hunters. And we're the prey." Kovac, meanwhile, was frantically working at one of the consoles. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "The growths, they're not just organic. They're integrated into the station's systems like some kind of biomechanical interface. It's evolving." "Evolving into what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Before Kovac could respond, the reactor's monitors flickered, and a new image appeared. It was a face, human but distorted, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The voice that followed was fragmented and eerie, like 1,000 whispers layered over one another. "You should not have come." The lights dimmed, and the hum of the reactor grew louder, almost deafening. I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet, and a cold dread settled over me. "Kovac," I said, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. "Shut it down. Whatever it is, shut it down." "I'm trying," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "But it's fighting me. The system's locked me out." "Then unlock it," I snapped. "We can't let this thing—" I didn't get to finish. The door behind us buckled, a deep dent forming in the metal as something heavy slammed against it. Then came the clicking, the same sound we'd heard in the corridor, but louder, more insistent. "They're here," Mendez said, rising to his feet despite the pain in his arm. "Hold them off," I ordered, raising my rifle. "Kovac, you've got 2 minutes. Make them count." The door groaned again, and I braced myself. Whatever came through that door, I would make sure it remembered what it meant to face a human. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. The first impact against the door was loud enough to reverberate through the entire room. The second hit left a visible dent, warping the thick steel. By the third, I could see faint cracks forming along the edges of the reinforced frame. Whatever was out there wasn't just strong, it was relentless. "They're going to get through," Mendez said grimly, his voice a low growl as he steadied his rifle. Blood had soaked through the patch I'd applied to his arm, but he stood tall, determined. "They'll have to go through us first," I replied, glancing at Kovac. He was hunched over the console, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a blur. "Kovac," I barked, "how much longer?" "Not long," he stammered. "I just need to override the secondary protocols, but this system is fighting me. It's like it's alive." I didn't have time to process that. The fourth impact split the room's tension wide open as the door buckled inward, revealing jagged gaps where the frame had begun to peel away. A low, guttural growl filtered through the opening, followed by the clicking sound we'd come to fear. My grip on my rifle tightened. "Mendez, on me," I ordered. "We hold this line." When the door gave way, it wasn't a slow breach. The entire frame collapsed inward, scattering debris across the floor as the creatures poured in. They moved with a sickening grace, spindly limbs encased in black chitinous armor, their glowing eyes filled with predatory intent. They were smaller than the first one we'd encountered, but no less dangerous. These were hunters, lean and fast, with claws that glinted under the dim reactor lights. "Contact!" I shouted, firing the first shot. My rifle spat a burst of high-velocity rounds, each impact sparking off their armored hides. Mendez joined me, his controlled bursts ripping into the closest creature. It shrieked and staggered back, black ichor spraying from its wounds. But the others didn't even flinch. They just kept coming. "Kovac!" I shouted over the gunfire. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster!" "I'm trying," he yelled back. "The system's locking me out at every turn. It's like it knows what we're doing." The creatures closed the distance faster than I'd anticipated. One leapt toward me, claws outstretched, and I barely managed to sidestep its attack. My knife was in my hand before I even realized I'd drawn it, and I drove the blade into the creature's side. Its chitin cracked under the force, and it let out a piercing scream before collapsing at my feet. Another was already on me. It swiped at my torso, and I felt the sharp sting of claws cutting through my armor. I stumbled back, raising my rifle just in time to fire point blank into its chest. The impact sent it reeling, but not before it raked my arm with another vicious swipe. Pain flared, hot and immediate, but I didn't stop moving. "Mendez, fall back!" I called. "Keep them away from Kovacs!" He didn't respond, not verbally at least. Instead, he shifted his fire, covering me as I retreated toward the console. The creatures were everywhere now, darting through the room like shadows given form. For every one we took down, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Kovacs!" I shouted again. "What's the holdup?" "I need another minute," he cried. "The reactor's core is shielded. I can't bypass the containment protocols without—" Another impact rocked the console, and Kovacs let out a startled yelp. One of the creatures had scaled the reactor itself, its claws digging into the cylindrical structure as it hissed down at him. Before it could pounce, Mendez fired, the shot catching it mid-leap. It hit the ground hard, convulsing as black ichor pooled beneath it. "You owe me," Mendez muttered, breathing heavily. "Add it to my tab," Kovacs replied, his voice shaking, but his fingers still moving. The air grew thicker, the reactor humming louder as Kovacs worked. The room's lights began to flicker, casting everything in an erratic strobe effect that made it even harder to track the creature's movements. My arm burned from the shallow cuts, but I forced myself to focus, my rifle swinging from target to target as I fired in controlled bursts. "They're learning," Mendez said, his voice grim. He was right. The creatures weren't just attacking mindlessly anymore. They were probing us, testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses. One feigned a charge to draw my fire, while another tried to flank us. I caught it out of the corner of my eye and fired, but the realization sent a chill down my spine. "They're working together," I muttered. "They're coordinating." "No way," Mendez replied. "They're animals." "Are they?" I countered, my gaze flicking to the black growths on the walls. They pulsed in rhythm with the reactor's hum, like a heartbeat echoing through the room. It wasn't just the creatures that were alive, the whole station was. Finally, Kovacs let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it! Reactor core unlocked!" "Good," I said, still firing at the advancing creatures. "Now tell me you can use it to blow this place to hell." Kovacs hesitated. "I can, but it's going to take time. The reactor has multiple fail-safes, and if I don't bypass them manually, the overload won't trigger." "How much time?" Mendez asked, reloading his rifle. 5 minutes, maybe 10, Kovacs replied, his voice tight, but once it's set, there's no turning back. I didn't hesitate. "Do it. We'll hold them off." The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and violence. The creatures pressed harder, their movements more aggressive, as if they could sense what we were planning. Mendez and I fell into a rhythm, covering each other as we shifted positions, our rifles blazing in the flickering light. The air was thick with the stench of burned chitin and the acrid tang of spent ammunition. One of the creatures lunged at Mendez, catching him off guard. He managed to shove it back with the butt of his rifle, but not before it raked its claws across his side. He stumbled, blood staining his uniform, but he didn't go down. "I'm fine," he grunted through gritted teeth, firing again. "Just keep them off Kovacs." I didn't argue, my focus narrowing to the task at hand. The creatures were relentless, but so were we. Every shot, every movement, was a reminder of what made us human. Our refusal to give up, no matter the odds. "Done!" Kovacs shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "Reactor overload initiated." The creatures froze, their glowing eyes flicking toward the reactor as if they understood what was happening. Then, as one, they turned and bolted, retreating into the shadows. "They're running?" Mendez said, disbelief in his voice. "No," I replied, my stomach sinking. "They're regrouping." The reactor's hum grew louder, its lights pulsing in a steady rhythm. A timer appeared on Kovacs' console, counting down from 10 minutes. "That's our window," I said. "We get to the escape pods, or we die here." "What about the creatures?" Mendez asked. "We'll deal with them if we have to," I replied, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. But if we don't leave now, this whole place goes up with us. Kovac hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. What if they follow us? I met his gaze. Then we make sure they don't survive the trip. We gathered what little supplies we could carry and set out, the reactor's countdown ticking in my mind like a metronome. The corridors were eerily quiet now, the creatures nowhere to be seen. But I knew better than to believe we were safe. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The station seemed to pulse with life as we moved. The air was heavier now, saturated with the same faint metallic tang that had followed us since we first boarded. Black, pulsing growths spread further across the walls and ceilings, their web-like tendrils almost organic in appearance. Every step felt like wading deeper into something alive, something that knew we were there. "Stay sharp," I whispered, though the silence from Mendez and Kovac told me they didn't need the reminder. Both men were tense, their eyes darting toward every shadow as we crept through the narrow corridors. The timer on Kovac's datapad ticked down with relentless precision. 8:47, 8:46, 8:45. The reactor's overload had begun, and the station knew it. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as we passed. Somewhere deep within the station, I could hear faint sounds, clicking, scraping, and an unsettling low-frequency hum that made my teeth vibrate. "They're watching us," Mendez muttered, his voice barely audible. He was right. I could feel their presence, lingering just beyond the reach of our flashlights. The creatures weren't attacking, not yet. They were waiting, biding their time. "They're trying to funnel us," I said, gripping my rifle tightly. "Stay close. No one wanders off." We reached an intersection, the corridors splitting into 3 paths. Kovac checked his datapad, his hands trembling as he swiped through the station's schematics. "This way," he said, pointing to the left. "It's the fastest route to the escape pods." I hesitated, scanning the corridor. The black growths were thicker here, pulsing in time with the faint hum that reverberated through the station. It felt like stepping into the belly of a beast. "Fastest doesn't mean safest," I said, my gut twisting with unease. "We don't have time to debate," Kovac replied, his voice rising with panic. "We have less than 8 minutes." I looked at Mendez, who nodded grimly. "We'll clear the way," I said. "Stay behind us." The corridor was narrow, forcing us into a single file line. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the grotesque textures of the walls. The black growth seemed to twitch and ripple as we passed, as if reacting to our presence. Then a sound, a faint, wet squelching, echoed from up ahead. I froze, raising a fist to signal the others to stop. The sound grew louder, closer, and I tightened my grip on my rifle. "Something's coming," Mendez said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The squelching turned into a rhythmic thud, and then it appeared, a massive creature, larger than any we'd seen before. Its body was an unholy amalgamation of flesh and metal, with jagged chitinous plates covering its torso and long, serrated claws that glinted in the flickering light. Its face was twisted and grotesque, with glowing eyes that burned with intelligence and malice. "Back!" I shouted, opening fire. The creature let out a deafening roar, charging toward us with terrifying speed. My rounds sparked off its armored hide, but it barely slowed. Mendez fired as well, his shots punching through weaker points in the creature's plating. It screeched in pain, but kept coming, swiping at us with claws that tore through the walls like paper. "Kovac, go!" I yelled. "Get to the escape pods." "But—" "Now!" I barked, firing another burst at the creature. Kovac hesitated for a split second before turning and running down the corridor. Mendez and I held our ground, moving in sync as we fired at the advancing beast. My rifle clicked empty, and I quickly ejected the magazine, slamming in a fresh one. The creature lunged, its claws slicing through the air inches from my face. I ducked and drove my knife into a gap in its armor, twisting hard. It screeched again, flailing wildly, and Mendez took the opportunity to land a shot directly into its exposed side. The creature stumbled, ichor spilling from the wound, but it wasn't done. "Fall back!" I shouted, grabbing Mendez's arm and pulling him toward the corridor's end. The creature roared in frustration, clawing at the walls as it struggled to follow. We regrouped with Kovacs in a larger chamber, the old hydroponics bay, now unrecognizable. The walls and floor were completely overtaken by the black growths, which had formed bulbous, pulsing masses that emitted a sickly green glow. In the center of the room stood a structure that made my blood run cold. The Hive Queen. It was massive, towering over the chamber like a grotesque monument. Its body was a nightmarish fusion of organic and mechanical components, with spindly limbs that stretched impossibly far. A bulbous sac pulsated at its core, connected to the black growths that spread throughout the station. Its head was elongated, with multiple glowing eyes that swiveled toward us as we entered. "Is that—" Kovacs began, his voice breaking. "The source," I said, cutting him off. "This is where it all started." The Queen let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, and the walls around us came alive. Smaller creatures emerged from the growths, crawling out of hidden alcoves and descending from the ceiling. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all moving in perfect synchronization. "Move!" I yelled, firing at the nearest ones. "We have to take her out!" The room erupted into chaos. Mendez and I laid down suppressive fire, trying to hold back the swarm while Kovacs scrambled to bypass the final lockdown on the escape pod bay. The creatures were relentless, their movements eerily coordinated as they closed in on us. My shots were precise, each one finding its mark, but for every creature I took down, another seemed to take its place. The Queen remained still, watching us with cold, calculating intent. It didn't need to move. It was controlling the hive, orchestrating the attack with terrifying efficiency. "Kovacs, how much longer?" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Almost there," he replied, his fingers flying across his datapad. The creatures pressed harder, forcing us to retreat further into the chamber. Mendez shouted in pain as one of them slashed at his leg, but he kept firing, his determination unwavering. "We're not going to make it," he said, his voice filled with both defiance and grim acceptance. "Yes, we are," I replied, my jaw set. "We have to." I turned my attention to the Queen, my mind racing. If we could disrupt her control, the hive might fall apart. But getting close enough to do any real damage was a suicide mission. Unless... "Mendez," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. "Cover me." "What are you—" "Just do it!" I yelled, sprinting toward the Queen. The creatures swarmed, but Mendez's covering fire kept them at bay long enough for me to reach the Queen. I pulled a plasma charge from my belt, our last explosive, and activated it. The Queen's eyes locked onto me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something almost human in their gaze. It wasn't fear or anger. It was understanding. I shoved the charge into the pulsating sac at the Queen's core and turned to run. The creatures screamed in unison, their movements becoming frantic and erratic as the Queen let out an ear-splitting roar. I barely made it back to Mendez and Kovacs before the charge detonated, the explosion ripping through the chamber in a blinding flash of light. The hive fell silent. We stumbled into the escape pod bay as the station's countdown reached its final minutes. Kovacs had managed to unlock the pods, and we climbed into one, sealing the hatch just as the station began to collapse around us. Through the viewport, I watched as Hadron-7 was consumed by fire, the reactor's overload tearing it apart piece by piece. "It's over," Mendez said, slumping back in his seat. I nodded, my body finally relaxing as exhaustion set in. For now. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The creatures, the hive, the Queen, they were a reminder of what humanity was capable of, both our greatest triumphs and our darkest mistakes. And as we drifted away from the wreckage of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had survived. The escape pod hummed quietly, its automated systems working to put as much distance as possible between us and the collapsing station. Through the viewport, Hadron-7 was a blazing inferno, the explosion consuming it in waves of fire and debris. The reactor overload had done its job. The black growths, the creatures, the Hive Queen, it was all gone. At least that's what I told myself. I slumped back into my seat, my body aching from the countless cuts and bruises I'd collected during the nightmare. My breathing slowed, the adrenaline finally subsiding. For the first time in hours, silence enveloped us, broken only by the faint hum of the pod's engines. But the relief was hollow, overshadowed by the losses we'd suffered and the knowledge that the danger hadn't truly been eradicated. "You okay, Vega?" Mendez asked, his voice gravelly from exhaustion. He sat across from me, his face pale but determined, his leg crudely bandaged where the creature had slashed him. His blood-stained uniform was a testament to his resilience. "Define okay," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Alive? Sure. Everything else? Not so much." Kovac sat in the corner, his datapad clutched tightly in his hands. His eyes were red, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. But he didn't look up. He was staring at the screen, scrolling through something I couldn't see. "What are you doing, Kovac?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He flinched but didn't stop. I downloaded some of the data before we triggered the reactor. The logs, research files, schematics. I thought maybe... "Maybe what?" I snapped, leaning forward. "That we could salvage something from this nightmare? That the corporation might pay you a bonus for risking all our lives?" "Easy, Vega," Mendez interjected, raising a hand. "We're all on edge." Kovac finally looked up, his eyes wide with something between guilt and desperation. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about understanding what we just faced. If we don't learn from this, what's to stop it from happening again?" I wanted to argue, to yell at him for being reckless, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew he was right. Humanity had a habit of repeating its mistakes, and what happened on Hadron-7 was no exception. The creatures, the Hive, the biomechanical horror we'd faced, they were born from human ambition. Someone, somewhere, would try again. And next time, there might not be anyone left to stop it. "Fine," I said, my voice heavy. "But that data doesn't leave your hands, not until we figure out who we can actually trust." Kovac nodded quickly, relief flooding his face. "I understand. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I muttered, leaning back and closing my eyes. I wanted to rest, to let the quiet hum of the pod lull me into unconsciousness, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The silence didn't last. An alarm blared, snapping us all to attention. The pod's lights dimmed, replaced by the harsh red glow of emergency protocols. A message scrolled across the console. "Unidentified foreign biological contaminant detected." "No," I whispered, my stomach sinking. "No, no, no." "What the hell is that?" Mendez demanded, his rifle already in his hands. "Tell me that's a glitch." "It's not," Kovac said, his voice trembling. "The pod's scanners are detecting something alive." I stood, scanning the cramped interior. The pod was small, with no hidden compartments, no places for anything to hide. And yet, the alarm persisted, a shrill reminder that we weren't alone. "Check yourselves," I ordered, my voice firm despite the panic clawing at my chest. "Any cuts? Any scratches? Look for signs of infection." We moved quickly, inspecting each other with a grim efficiency born of desperation. Mendez's leg wound looked clean, as did my own injuries. But when we turned to Kovac, the truth became horrifyingly clear. His neck. A faint, black vein-like pattern spread from a small puncture wound at the base of his neck, pulsing faintly with a sickly green glow. He touched it hesitantly, his fingers trembling. What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's the Hive," I said, my throat tightening. "It's in you." "No!" Kovac backed away, his eyes wild with fear. "I'm fine! I feel fine!" "Then why is the alarm screaming?" Mendez said harshly, stepping forward. "You're infected." "I can fight it!" Kovac cried, his voice breaking. "We can fix this! There has to be a way!" "There isn't," I said, cutting him off. My heart ached as I looked at him, but there was no time for hope or sentiment. "It's already in your system. You're a risk to everyone. I'm not. Kovac froze, his body convulsing suddenly. He gasped, clutching his chest as he collapsed to the floor. His datapad clattered from his hands, and he let out a strangled scream as his body began to spasm. Vega, Mendez started, but I was already moving. I raised my rifle, aiming it at Kovac as he writhed on the floor. Black tendrils began to emerge from his skin, spreading rapidly as the hive infection took hold. His screams grew inhuman, his voice distorted into something guttural and alien. Don't do this, he pleaded, his words slurred. I can fight it. Please. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment, I saw the man he'd been, the tech specialist who had fought beside us, who had risked his life to help us escape. But that man was gone, consumed by the very thing we'd tried to destroy. I'm sorry, I whispered, and I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the pod, and Kovac fell silent. The black tendrils stopped spreading, his body going limp as ichor pooled beneath him. I lowered my rifle, my hands shaking. Mendez placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but understanding. You did what you had to. Did I? I asked, my voice hollow. Because it doesn't feel like enough. The pod's alarm finally stopped, the silence almost deafening in its absence. But the weight in my chest didn't lift. We had escaped the station, but at what cost? Kovac was gone, and the infection, whatever it was, had proven it could survive. Had we truly destroyed the hive, or had we just delayed the inevitable? As the pod drifted toward the nearest habitable outpost, I stared out at the void, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What would happen if the infection reached another station, another colony? Was it already too late to stop what we'd unleashed? Mendez sat beside me, his rifle across his lap. He didn't speak, but his presence was grounding, a reminder that we weren't entirely alone. For now, we had survived. For now, humanity still had a chance. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over. The echo of Hadron-7 would follow us, a haunting reminder of what we'd faced, and what might still come. In the vast emptiness of space, the only certainty was this. Humanity had made its mark, for better or worse. And whatever came next, we would face it the only way we knew how, together and unrelenting.